Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and I am up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. This week, we're going to talk about a novella by Stephen King called N. This story, I just have to say, before I get into the details of it, I think is one of the most brilliantly written modern cosmic horror stories that I've read in a really long time. I'm impressed with the ways that the classic elements of cosmic horror are updated for a modern situation. And, to me, that's one of the beauties about cosmic horror as a subgenre, is that it really is very versatile in a lot of ways. And it really can encompass a number of different, elements of horror that I think people don't often, associate or immediately associate with cosmic horror. Now, N, as I mentioned, is a novella. It was published first in Just After Sunset. The publication date for that was November 2008. Now, one might think, because it is a cosmic horror story, that Lovecraft was an influence. But King has said in interviews and in the book itself that the story was inspired by Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. And King has said before that this story is a, hugely influential horror story, one of the perfectly written horror stories of all time. The Great God Pan. And to quote, he said, "Not Lovecraft. It's a riff on Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, which is one of the best horror stories ever written, maybe the best in the English language. Mine isn't anywhere near that good, but I love the chance to put neurotic behavior, obsessive compulsive disorder, together with the idea of a monster-filled macroverse." End quote. And to me, that is pretty much a primary element of cosmic horror, is this idea of a monstrous macroverse that, intersects with sanity and insanity and the everyday. And a lot of Stephen King's, work is about the strange intersecting with normal everyday life. Now, some of the things I think that make this a classic cosmic horror story, it's written in epistolary format, which Lovecraft did. That is not unique to cosmic horror so much as it was unique to a literary trend of a time before Lovecraft, slightly before Lovecraft, maybe within the first 20 to 40 years maybe before Lovecraft. But it does sort of give it that feel, that idea that it's a, recording within a letter. It's materials that are taken almost secondhand, and that we have to kind of dive through the layers to get at the heart of the matter. A lot of Lovecraft's work did that because essentially it's putting up barriers between the real and the unreal, to show that we are far enough removed, but that in getting through those layers, the threat with each layer becomes greater. Essentially, to summarize the plot, it is about a man, I believe he's like a middle-aged, maybe 40s or 50s, a man called N, who seems like a really great guy, except for this one affliction that he has, which, to simplify, you could say was obsessive compulsive disorder. He goes to a therapist, John Bon Saint, whose notes about the different sessions that he has with N formulate at least the first half of this novella, where the second half is more how the information that N has passed on to John Bon Saint, how it influences him, and in the future, how that ripples outward. But essentially, N comes to him with the idea that he has picked up OCD as a kind of virus. That, he used to take pictures. He was a photographer by hobby, by avocation, and that he goes out to a place, near a local place that the therapist is aware of, that it was a place near where he grew up, and to this field, and in this field, he finds a thin spot between worlds, which would be the best way to describe it. There is a little bit, now, one of the Machen influences of this, and we've talked about Arthur Machen's work before, and how there is most definitely, which is not Lovecraftian, but is an element of cosmic horror, this idea of nature as a powerful and indifferent force, that a lot of the entities, and often the entities, in Lovecraft's work represented the other, or, alien races, people who were alien to us. Machen's work attributed to those entities the same kind of power, the same kind of awesomeness, the same kind of cosmic import, but that they were often reflections of natural in the supernatural, that nature was just, or that the supernatural really was just another evolution of nature, or another layer of nature, and that the great forces of nature were just as indifferent and rendered us just as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And that's kind of what we find here. So, King was right that there's more of a Machen influence, really, than a Lovecraftian influence in this cosmic horror story, because we have a ring of stones, which is very much like the traditional Celtic kind of idea of doorways between worlds, which Machen was very much into. And it is the number and confirmation of the existence of these stones that keeps the doorway closed. And this is where we have the introduction of the element of OCD. Okay. This idea that in capturing in place all 8 stones, and that 8th stone in particular, one could keep the doorway closed and the creatures behind it held at bay for a time. And that, the influence that you carry with you from this place, that need to have balance, to have order, to confirm the existence of, basically the tent poles of our reality, by touching them or placing them or putting them in a certain order or counting them, was reassuring that they were there and that our world is safe, which I think is an absolutely brilliant idea, because to get at the heart of anxiety or OCD, which is very much a debilitating kind of disorder, there is a sort of element of that. There is that sort of almost superstitious belief that by bearing the burden of your anxiety, by completing these obsessive compulsive tasks, you are somehow righting the world. You are somehow protecting against the bad things that can happen. And honestly, I mean, what is occult magic other than a series of rituals performed to keep evil at bay and to protect your loved ones? So we have a sort of blending of, sane and insane. Obviously, he's going to the therapist. He is claiming that this disorder is taking him over body and soul. We have that element of sanity and insanity. And we have that element of the supernatural. And what is most important here is that in this cosmic horror tale, the boundaries between reality and whatever lies beyond reality, the boundaries between sanity and insanity, of rational thought and crippling thought, which is kind of how the therapist Bon Saint sees sanity and insanity, is whether or not you can function in your day-to-day life, doing the thing you're doing, being held by the ideas that you have in your head. If you are sane, you can function under those conditions. If you are not, then it's because those conditions are making life unbearable for you. That insanity is really just a matter of distortion of perception that makes it difficult to function as a person in society. And that's kind of an interesting idea too, because the idea of insanity, which is so prevalent in so much of cosmic horror, is there in a very practical and realistic and identifiable way. And again, I think that's something that makes a lot of King's work resonate with people, is this idea that, however supernatural it is, at the heart of it, the horror's only crossing the line over reality a little bit. Enough that the superstitious parts of us, the instinct parts of us, the parts of us that are still afraid of the dark, those parts can believe that. Those parts still hold on to that. The same way that people with anxiety and OCD hold on to the idea that if they worry enough, or if they complete enough of these rituals, everything will be okay. Now, we also have the ultimate insignificance of humanity, which is pretty much the standard of cosmic horror. And we have it in an interesting way. Again, modern cosmic horror reframes a lot of the overall insignificance of humanity by showing the effect that it has on an individual, and then having that person reframe what's important. And in this particular case, and ultimately in cosmic horror, what we find is that the forces they're dealing with, whether they beat them or not, are still more overwhelming and somehow more reductionist to us than we would be comfortable believing. And that's kind of the case here. N is singled out eventually as a guardian, as a kind of gatekeeper, that it becomes his job, because he can't stay away from this field, it becomes his job to right the world again, to make sure this door doesn't open. And it's not something like in a lot of horror you think, well, why don't you just walk away from the situation? Why don't you just stop doing it? That's the nature of anxiety and OCD, is that you can't. Your own brain won't let you. And in this particular case, that's the situation. He knows, or thinks he knows, or wonders if he really does know, that if he just stops, is the world really going to be upset? Is it really going to be tilted on its axis in such an unpleasant way, in such an unfixable way? And he comes to find that whether or not it's in his head, it doesn't matter, because he believes it and he feels it in his gut, and he can't help. He is compelled to try to right the world. If not for himself, then for his daughter and for the people he cares about. But this is an awful lot of responsibility. This is a lot to put on one person. And it ultimately causes the downfall from guardian to guardian to guardian. And when N comes to see Dr. Bon Saint, he's exhausted. He's absolutely exhausted, and he's suicidal. And this is the thing that Bon Saint sees a lot of, and this is another, I think, very well-crafted aspect of the story, is that Bon Saint is a good therapist. And he is a caring therapist, and probably incredibly qualified to treat people with these kind of disorders. And because of that, he is completely unprepared to help somebody like N, because it would have to be, there would have to be some acknowledgement that you've crossed from skewed perceptions of reality into skewed reality. And Bonsaint, to do that for a man like him, or maybe for any kind of person, it can be, detrimental. It can be over time, basically, a terminal situation for people. But what we come to find is that, the other aspect of this, which I think is kind of interesting, and which also sort of blurs the line between, reality and our perception of reality, is that this OCD virus that N has, he fully believes is contagious and is hesitant to talk to a therapist about it because he feels that by discussing it, he may very well be passing on the virus like cold germs, and that Dr. Bonsaint would then feel compelled to seek this place out, and then the onus of keeping the world straight, keeping the world in order, would fall on him, which is ultimately what happens when, and as we often do in the show, there are spoilers here, when N ultimately commits suicide. It falls on Dr. Bonsaint, who tries to put this out of his head as the delusions of a patient, but finds that he ultimately can't. And the insidious aspect of this is that it happens slowly over time, that he finds he's curious about this place, and so he finds it. And then he finds that he can't rest until he does put that 8th stone in place, which can only be seen through a lens of some type. And again, we have that reinforcement, that idea of skewed perception, that we can't trust necessarily what our eyes are seeing, but that through the lenses of other things, like a camera or even a plastic bag, are we seeing something delusional, or are we seeing reality because we're looking at it through a different lens? So there's that element there of, the blurring, and maybe that's a better way of saying it than sanity and insanity as a primary cosmic horror element, is this idea of, what we consider insanity is just a skewed perception of reality. And that so much of, what we think of as insanity is this inability to determine whether our perception is skewed or whether reality itself is skewed. And in cosmic horror, that line is very thin. That boundary is very blurred. But ultimately, what we have about the insignificance of humanity in all of this is that although the Guardian, you'd think that it's almost the antithesis of this, that the Guardian is the ultimate important person in the universe, it is too much for any one person to handle. The keeping the world straight, keeping the doorway closed, keeping the entities beyond it at bay is too much. It's too much for any one person to do, and ultimately drives them to their destruction. And so what we have is a temporary fix. If a Guardian commits suicide, the door closes. But by then, the virus is generally already passed on to someone else, or shortly will be. And as soon as a new Guardian is chosen, it happens all over again. So Guardians are replaceable. Humanity is replaceable. And ultimately, no matter how good or strong or smart or mentally fit a person is, ultimately this force from beyond, from another space and time, is going to destroy any human it comes in contact with. It cannot be overcome. And that's really kind of terrifying. And this moves from N to his therapist, to his therapist's sister, and onward we're led to believe to an old childhood friend of theirs who is also a therapist, who now is taking it upon himself to find out why this rash of suicides in this one space over this one nebulous issue, why this is happening. We, and again, we have this implication that one person can't and shouldn't be responsible for a task of such magnitude. We also understand that, knowledge, as in a lot of cosmic horror, knowledge is the ultimate downfall. Knowing is the start of the infection. Once you know that this thing exists out there in the field, you become automatically compelled to make it work, to keep things right. The OCD is a symptom that intensifies and drains the life out of a person. We have this idea that of knowing versus blissful ignorance. If N had never come to the therapist to talk, the therapist would never have known that the world needed somebody to write it again, and would have continued on in an ignorant but blissful security that everything was okay. So again, in modern cosmic horror, we have that element of knowledge, the ultimate knowledge, the ultimate pursuit of knowledge, which through this is a compulsion because of OCD. But this understanding of worlds beyond worlds is an ultimately destructive force to humanity. We have the concepts of balance versus chaos. When we did the Fall of Cthulhu comic series not too long ago, at the end of last year, we talked about the idea that modern cosmic horror and cosmic horror in general, Lovecraftian stuff in general, looks at the balance between the chaos of worlds unknown versus the relative balance of what we already do know, of the world that we are familiar with, that there are certain laws of physics and science and psychology that work a certain way, and that we can sort of build however flimsy or tentative structure it is, we can build a structure in our minds of security and safety based on understanding the way the world works. For example, you know that if it's snowing out, you're cold. You're going to be cold. So you don't walk outside and spend the night outside naked because you'll freeze to death. So you can be secure in the idea that if you have clothes and you're warm and you're inside a house and it snows outside, the snow's not going to kill you. You know, there are certain poisonous animals. We know that if we don't touch them, or if we live in a place where they don't exist, we're okay. We're not going to die from them. What cosmic horror does is it leaks that danger into our foundation of security, and that danger basically eats away at the foundation until it collapses. So, and that is the chaos. That is the chaos of, I had read somewhere, and as longtime listeners will know, I'm not great with science, although I love it. I'm just not great at complex scientific concepts. But one of the things I do remember reading is that entropy is the progression of things toward a state of decay or disorder or chaos, and that nature naturally moves in that direction. It naturally moves toward a state of chaos, and that a lot of times it's a force working against it that keeps things in order, that keeps things balanced. And if you think about it, I mean, it's true. If you leave a house abandoned for 5, 10, 20 years, it starts to fall apart, you know? Because a lot of the things that we come to think of in those terms are things that we have made to recalibrate the balance between forces of nature which are bigger and deadlier and indifferent to us, and our own state of security and safety. And when those things fall apart, we feel less safe. Cosmic horror introduces the elements that would cause those things to fall apart. And finally, what we have on the other side of the doorway, we don't ever get to see through the doorway to the other world, but we do see some element of what exists there. Now, part of this, again, is instinct. Part of it is gut instinct. We as creatures, who have evolved to protect ourselves from predators and other kinds of dangers, have a gut instinct about things that will hurt us, things that are dangerous. The problem with anxiety, again, and with OCD, which is basically an outlier of anxiety or an offshoot of it, is that anxiety often distorts things enough so that we can't always recalibrate what is actually dangerous to us and what might be dangerous to us. But because it feels the same. It feels like a gut instinct all the same. And it takes a great deal of self-awareness and sometimes therapy, sometimes medication to understand that the things that we're anxious about, which trigger the same things as a real danger, are not actually a real danger. What we have here is this personified in the idea of an entity called Cthulhu. Now, even that seems to be a nod or an homage to, Cthulhu and Lovecraftian cosmic horror entities. The leaves of the field spell out Cthulhu. N won't even say the word. He writes it down because he believes that, like in a lot of magical systems, the idea of names having power is very strong. But instead of having power over something because you know its name, it has power over you if you use its name. It's almost like a Voldemort kind of situation. But Cthulhu is described as a leathery, helmet-headed monster, a tunnel and a funnel. It's described as almost looking different at different times of year, depending how strong it is, depending on how much of it has been able to materialize. It is also at one point described as a three-lobed burning eye, which is a direct reference to Lovecraft. But the idea is that it is a monster and it is watching, that it can see him, that it can, exert influence over him. It is, and he even theorizes, or maybe it's Bonsane, I forget. One of them does theorize, though, that this creature might only even be a baby. It might only be one of many in that other world, trying to break through, trying to break past that eighth stone. And, it in and of itself is, to the perceiver, far more powerful and deadly, and it's still behind a gateway it can't cross. And it is still destroying lives. It is still waiting patiently, like, the ancient entities of cosmic horror of old, for that chance to break through to our world. Now, why, what its intentions are, what it plans to do here, why it is as threatening as it is, that isn't explained because there is no way to know that. Which is also, a common element in cosmic horror, that the motivations, even if we're given the personality of the entity, we're not always, given access to the motivations or the true purpose, the true thought patterns of a cosmic horror entity, because it is probably something beyond. We don't know why a storm destroys the things that it does. We can track its trajectory. We can track its pathway. But if there was some sentient purpose to destroying the things that it does, it would be beyond our ability to know that, and that's kind of what these entities are. They're a force of nature from beyond our nature and into someone else's nature. And it is just far enough removed from us that we can't understand why the threat is, only that it is. And that there's something terrifying about that. There's something terrifying about knowing something can hurt you without knowing specifically why. And again, that is kind of at the heart of anxiety. You know something will hurt you. And the only things that, but there's nothing, it's almost like, as I mentioned, there really are so many parallels that, it will hurt you, but you can't prove it. There's no, foundation for it other than, possible coincidence. And you can't fix it because it's not substantial enough to fight. It's not here yet. Anxiety is often the fear of what might happen, not what is happening. Because if, once you identify the monster, once it's in your presence, you can fight it. But you can't fight a looming threat that hasn't made itself known yet. And that's what anxiety is. This creature is the personification or the animification. I maybe have made that word up. But it is the, crystallizing of anxiety and what anxiety does to you, which is destroy you with the possibility of what if. It is the fear of the unknown. And ultimately, the beauty of this cosmic horror story is that we are left to believe that it is just an endless cycle of, at best, the best we can hope for is the destruction of individuals for the protection of the whole. But ultimately, how long can that hold out? At what point will those things break through? Will our anxieties become realities? So that's N by Stephen King and Just After Sunset. If you enjoyed this episode of Cosmic Horror, you may enjoy past, present, and future episodes of Cosmic Horror. You can find them any place for free that podcasts are broadcast. That's iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Project Entertainment Network, all those places. You can also check out another podcast that I co-host with Brian Keene called The Horror Show with Brian Keene. You can check out engineer Matt Wildeson's podcast Grindcast, which talks all things pop culture and often cosmic horror-y goodness, and his book Horrors Untold, which is also full of cosmic horror-y goodness. And I will see you next week, and we will talk more cosmic shenanigans then. Okay, bye.
In a world where podcasts lurk around every corner.
Listen, we just have to give the people what they want. Get it together.
Authors Tim Meyer and Chad Scanlon invite you to an hour of sophisticated conversation.
I just want to rip your head off for even saying that.
Dude, I am just saying what you're thinking.
From movies and TV to special guests, you name it, they've got it.
I'd rather gouge my eyes out than watch that movie ever again.
That's one of the finest movies of our generation.
How are you both married?
Join them every Wednesday exclusively from the Project Entertainment Network.